a man who commanded the faith of millions worldwide, raking in $140 million annually. Living in a sprawling mansion with a private jet, suddenly breaks down in tears on live television, confessing, "I have sinned," to a stunned audience of 7,000 in person and millions more watching at home. This is the story of Jimmy Swaggart, the televangelist whose spectacular rise and devastating fall didn't just destroy his own empire. It changed how America views religious leaders forever. But here's what makes this story absolutely mind-blowing. Swaggart wasn't just any preacher. He was the king of televangelism, a man whose voice reached into living rooms across the globe, whose ministry employed over 1,500 people and was generating $500,000 every single day. Yet behind the scenes, he was living a double life so scandalous that when it finally came to light, it sent shockwaves through the entire religious establishment. To understand how catastrophic Swaggart's fall really was, you need to understand just how high he had climbed. Born into the rural Pentecostal world of Louisiana, Swaggart shared DNA with rock legend Jerry Lee Lewis and country singer Mickey Gilley. They were cousins. But while his famous relatives chased fame in honky-tonk bars, Swaggart was drawn to a different kind of spectacle. Revival meetings. At just 8 years old, Swaggart had what he claimed was a personal conversion experience. Soon after, he was seeking out revival meetings, those charged evangelistic gatherings filled with healing testimonies, speaking in tongues, and emotional altar calls. As a teenager, he hit the road with his wife Frances, singing and preaching in rural churches and makeshift tents wherever they could find an audience. But Swaggart had something special, a gift that would eventually make him one of the most powerful religious voices in America. His preaching style was electric. Picture fiery denunciations mixed with stirring musical interludes and emotionally charged appeals that made audiences feel the weight of sin and invited them into the drama of redemption. He wasn't just preaching. He was performing spiritual theater on a grand scale. What set Swaggart apart from other traveling evangelists was his early recognition of broadcast media's power. In 1971, he launched the Jimmy Swaggart Telecast, a 30-minute program combining preaching and music that started on just a handful of regional stations. But this was just the beginning of something much bigger. By the early 1980s, Swaggart's televised sermons were reaching millions internationally. His ministry was estimated to bring in more than $140 million a year. That's over $400 million in today's money. He had become one of the most influential Pentecostals in America, helping bring charismatic Christianity into the mainstream after decades of being dismissed as fringe religion. From his Baton Rouge headquarters, Swaggart presided over a sprawling empire that included a megachurch, a Bible college, recording studios, and extensive broadcasting facilities. At its peak, his ministry was one of Baton Rouge's largest employers, issuing more building permits than the entire state of Louisiana. The man who started preaching in rural tents now commanded a religious empire that dwarfed most corporations. But here's where the story takes a dark turn that would make even the most cynical Hollywood screenwriter pause. While Swaggart was publicly condemning sexual immorality from his pulpit, delivering harsh denunciations of sin to millions of viewers, he was privately engaged in the very behaviors he was condemning. The hypocrisy was staggering in its scope and audacity. In 1986, Swaggart led a public crusade to expose fellow minister Marvin Gorman's alleged adultery, leading to Gormans defrocking by their denomination. But Gorman was convinced that Swaggart was guilty of the very sins he was condemning in others. Seeking revenge, Gorman enlisted his son and son-in-law to follow Swaggart around, hoping to catch him in the act. On October 17, 1987, they got their smoking gun. They photographed Swaggart entering room 7 of a New Orleans motel with a local prostitute. When Gorman confronted him in the parking lot, Swaggart broke down and pleaded for mercy, offering to issue a public apology and even help restore Gorman's ministry in exchange for silence. But when months passed with no action, Gorman handed over the incriminating photographs to church leadership. What happened next became one of the most watched moments in television history. On February 21, 1988, Swaggart took to the pulpit and airwaves to deliver his now infamous "I have sinned" speech. With his normally powerful voice wavering and his face wet with tears, he confessed to having sinned and begged for forgiveness from an audience of 7,000 at his family worship center and millions watching on television. The confession was devastating in its impact. Television networks immediately dropped his broadcasts. Donations and church attendance plummeted. His Bible college lost students and accreditation. The man who had been a moral compass to millions became a national punchline overnight. Even Ozzy Osbourne wrote a song about him, but incredibly, the story doesn't end there. Just 3 years later, in 1991, Swaggart was caught again, this time pulled over by police in California while in the company of another prostitute. This second scandal seemed to make his cultural exile permanent. The king of televangelism had fallen not once, but twice. The consequences extended far beyond Swaggart himself. His scandal, along with others in the 1980s, fundamentally changed how Americans viewed religious leaders. Public opinion research from the era shows that these scandals hastened already rising cynicism toward organized religion and pushed many Americans toward disaffiliation. Swaggart's legacy became the cultural transformation that resulted from the erosion of Christian moral authority in public life. What makes this story particularly tragic is that Swaggart's gifts were genuinely extraordinary. He had the natural charisma of Billy Graham, the pugilistic instincts of Jerry Falwell, and arguably broader emotional appeal than either. Had he succeeded in his battles with personal temptation, we might today be discussing his legacy alongside the great Christian institution builders. Instead, he's remembered more for what he squandered than what he built. Yet even in disgrace, Swaggart never fully disappeared. He kept preaching from his family worship center in Baton Rouge. His radio broadcasts continued. His son Donnie and grandson Gabriel took up the family vocation. In 2022, he gave the eulogy at the funeral of his cousin Jerry Lee Lewis, evoking again the strange interplay of sacred and profane that defined his life. Jimmy Swaggart died this week at age 90, bringing to an end one of the most controversial and remarkable careers in American religious history. His story serves as a powerful reminder that the same gifts that can build empires can also destroy them. The man who once commanded the faith of millions around the world ultimately couldn't command himself. But perhaps most importantly, Swaggart's rise and fall illustrates something profound about American spirituality itself. Our endless quest for authentic religious experience, our fascination with charismatic leaders, and our capacity for both redemption and self-destruction. In the end, Jimmy Swaggart's story isn't just about one man's moral failure. It's about the complex, contradictory nature of American faith itself, and how one man's personal demons forever changed the landscape of religious authority in America. The king of televangelism is gone, but the questions his life raised about power, faith, and human frailty remain as relevant today as they were when he first uttered those 3 devastating words, "I have sinned."